as a subset of socialism. Over the course of the 1800s, a lot of countries in Europe started getting a lot more democratic, and political parties started forming to compete in elections. A lot of these political parties were socialist, and they tended to be dominated by Marxists, especially the SDP in Germany. Here's the problem, though. A big part of orthodox Marxism was the belief that the working class would have to revolt in a glorious, violent revolution because the ruling bourgeoisie would never willingly relinquish power. So the fact that Marxists were actually winning some elections wound up kind of discrediting Marxism. In response,
I'm going to jump out of the window. I can't handle this. Marx encouraged Marxists and communists and socialists, which to him are all the same thing, pretty much, to participate in elections, to participate in bourgeois elections. Yes, a lot of countries were becoming liberal democracies, right? They were having more political democracy, but Marx said we'll never have true political democracy without economic democracy. And then the bourgeois political system is never going to allow us to fully take power via elections, right? You're not just going to be able to have communists, socialists, Marxists run for enough elections and take power and transition the government to a socialist government and nicely, because the reactionaries and the propagandists and the capitalists will kill you, or control the media and destroy your campaign, or rig the election against you like they did to Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020 with the DNC collaboration with Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. But Marx never said don't run for office, right? Because you can be in the debates. You can go door knocking, door to door, and spread socialist communist ideas. You can win the election and even be able to push for socialist communist policies while in office. But the idea that we can never just have enough people be elected in order to take political power and then transition to socialism, that's been proven true. That hasn't discredited Marxism, as they say. Look at the Bernie campaigns in 2016 and 2020. Look at AOC, what she's doing right now, cozying up to Nancy Pelosi, cheering on the NATO proxy war in Ukraine, and refusing to fight for anything like Medicare for all, right? So for Marxists, campaigns and bourgeois elections dominated by the bourgeois legal system, are a way to spread our ideas, right? To get to the masses and spread our political program. But we understand that they're never going to let us just take power that way. Right? They're never going to let us take power unless we have the masses organized on the ground, and we change the bourgeois political system to a political system that actually gives the people the power, that actually brings the people democracy. And that idea has not discredited Marxism. I mean, it's been proven more and more true as time has passed. You can talk about countries like Venezuela, where they took power via election, but even in Venezuela, they've done what Lenin says you need to do in State and Revolution, which is transform the state machinery. And, a lot of people would argue that Venezuela needs to do more as far as transforming the state machinery and moving the surplus into the hands of the workers, me included. But they did that by having the workers organized at the grassroots en masse. Like when the U.S. came and kicked Hugo Chavez out of power after he won the election, things really changed in Venezuela. The working class realized they needed to be armed and organized, or the reactionaries weren't going to let them have this electoral form of socialism. And then they created like the People's or the Popular Assembly, whatever it's called, to try and give the people more direct access and control the government. Then they created this massive commune system where the people were organized into communes, and they made not only local political decisions, but they had direct input with national political decisions. Basically saying that they changed the way that the state machinery functioned. They smashed the ready-made state machinery, as Lenin would say, or didn't fully smash it, but they started to change it so that it can actually bring democracy to the workers, which is, there's no point in Marx where he actually says taking power via elections is impossible, right? He never says that it's not even a possibility at all. He just says it needs to be a revolutionary struggle, in that the workers need to be organized at the grassroots, and they need to be armed and connected and unified in their struggle if you're going to take political power at all. So it's not like Marx was looking at Marxists getting elected and saying, I hate this. I hate Marxists running for political campaigns we need a revolution because that's what my book said, right? If it was shown that workers could run for political office and win and start transitioning society to socialism, Marx would have embraced that. He would have been like, sweet, cool. It's going to be easier than I thought. But he understood that the reactionaries would never allow that, which has been proven right by time. So he said, you need a revolutionary struggle. That probably wasn't the most concise way for me to explain that. But that was just a really, really dumb and ahistorical point and a theoretical point.
Once, other, more moderate forms of socialism started popping up, like Fabianism in the UK. The Fabian socialists believed that the average worker would benefit best by a slow, peaceful, gradual transition to a more equitable, state-directed economy, and they would become very influential in the early days of the worker would benefit best by a slow, peaceful, gradual transition to a more equitable, state-directed economy, and they would become very influential in the early days of the British Labour Party. Meanwhile, in Russia, things were taking a different turn. The leader of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin, disagreed with orthodox Marxists on some issues, but unlike the more moderate social...
There was a rise in reformism at the time, and you have this thinker like Edward Bernstein, who actually takes Marxism after Marx is dead, I believe, or maybe Bernstein and Marx lived at the same time. But either way, Bernstein said, we don't need a revolutionary struggle. We just need to win elections, right? We need to win parliamentary elections, congressional elections, whatever, and then take power that way. We don't need a revolutionary struggle. And this is an anti-Marxist idea for the reasons I just explained. You do need a revolutionary struggle, even if it's not this violent, glorious uprising that Marx never ever described once in his life, right? Revolution doesn't necessarily mean a bunch of violence and destruction. Revolution just means a revolutionary change, a change in the political structure and the economic structure from capitalist to socialist, however that comes about. But Bernstein was saying, let's just run elections. Let's not do revolution, even if revolution is the best option, right? So that's the difference. It's not that Marx and Lenin were saying, only revolution because that's what our book said. That's what we predicted. Right? If it was possible to take power via elections, Marx and Lenin would have been like, awesome, great, let's do it. But it was being proven time and time again that socialism wasn't going to come about via, just electing enough AOC type politicians or whatever, to use a modern example. So Lenin started stressing the revolutionary struggle and started stressing, what Marx had said about bourgeois capitalist elections and the capitalist political system and how they're never going to let the working class actually take power. How the political system is rigged against the working masses. So you need a revolutionary, unified, organized struggle where the workers are armed so that they can protect themselves. That's the idea. And Bernstein said no revolution, only elections. Marx, Engels, Lenin said elections are fine. Revolutions are probably the only thing that's going to actually work and take power, though. And of course, Lenin was 100% right about that. If you look at how the Russian Revolution played out. But, they weren't like against elections the same way that Bernstein was against revolutionary struggle or a revolutionary uprising. They were okay with elections, as long as it's just being used to push Marxism. Like there were Bolsheviks who would run for office, right? There were people in Lenin's party in the government or doing that kind of stuff. So what do you mean he was completely against elections in any way, shape, or form?
Of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin disagreed with orthodox Marx.
Capitalism is a necessary stage of the evolution of society is my ass. Okay. I really wanted to see what they said Lenin and Marx disagreed upon. And they say, Lenin says that capitalism isn't a necessary stage in the evolution and development of society, which I don't know that Marx says that, right? Marx just, the only prediction that Marx got wrong was he thought the places where capitalism developed first would be the places where there were socialist revolutions first. But Lenin develops his theory of imperialism, says these capitalist countries are going to oppress these other countries where the workers will rise up first. Countries like Russia that had never developed capitalism, right? They had manufacturing and they had some capitalist industry, but it was mostly a feudal country or a semi-feudal country. So they had some manufacturing and industry in the cities, but then there were tons of peasants ruled by landlords. And then they didn't have a democracy or a liberal democracy, the capitalist political structure. They had a monarchy. They had a monarchy dominated by the czars. So Lenin said the working masses, the peasants and the workers, not just the industrial workers who Marx talked about, but the peasants as well, should ally together and overthrow the monarchy and transition to socialism. Now, because they hadn't transitioned to capitalism, they didn't have that much industry, right? They were mostly an agrarian society, so they basically had to level skip the transition through capitalism. They had to industrialize their country, which the Soviet Union at the time did faster than any other country in human history, and they did it without slavery, which the UK and the US needed. But yes, he did, come up with the worker-peasant alliance, which wasn't something Marx talked about. So it wasn't necessarily a disagreement, though, because Marx never said it will only be the industrial workers, or he never said for sure that, only in European countries where capitalism developed first, those will 100% be the first to transition. That's just where he was living and where capitalism had developed and where the workers were starting to rise up already. So he made that prediction. But he would have loved Lenin's worker-peasant alliance. He would have been like, what a great idea, Vlad.
Marxists on some issues, but unlike the more moderate socialists gaining ground in Europe, he still believed that revolution was the only way forward. Lenin and his followers broke off from the Russian Socialist Party and named themselves the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which, as far as I can tell, was the beginning of a revival of the word communist. It seems like they were using it in much the same way Marx had, as a way to separate themselves from other, more moderate socialists. After they gained power, a split formed in socialists around the world. On one hand were those who wanted to follow the example of the Soviet Union, who began calling themselves communists. They frequently formed their own parties specifically to challenge other socialists, and sometimes they were really successful. On the other hand, there were other socialists. Some were hardcore Marxists and some were more moderate gradualists, but
this is kind of true. I just don't know how they're talking about this without mentioning Bernstein, right? Because Bernstein was the guy who really created what this guy is describing as socialism. This idea that we don't need a revolutionary struggle. You also have John Maynard Keynes, the economist, who said capitalism will kind of transition to socialism on its own, also through elections and other means. But they need to mention the theoretical basis of this idea. They're just saying this is socialism, and Lenin and all the crazy revolutionaries are communists. They need to mention Bernstein, who took Marxism, because Lenin deeply understood Marxism, and there was nowhere where he really strongly disagreed with Marx. He just added on to Marx. He added on, we can have the worker-peasant alliance. Capitalism eventually develops into a stage of imperialism. These were additions to the science of Marxism, based on how capitalism had developed since Marx's death and based on the conditions that Lenin was living in. But he, the basis for everything he said was Marxism. It wasn't like he was this separate entity, this separate thing from Marx. A good way to describe it is that I've heard is Marxism is the fist and Leninism is the motion of the fist that throws the punch. Leninism is, how do we put Marxism into action and actually take power? But then you have Bernstein, who was, distinct from Marx, who did have a theory distinct from Marx, who said, no, we don't need a revolutionary struggle. Socialists will eventually win enough elections and we'll just peacefully transition out of capitalism. Obviously has been proven false, has been proven wrong with history. Anybody who worked for the Bernie campaign can tell you that in the U.S. that the capitalists in our country are not just going to let socialism take power by voting for the right guy. But yeah, I don't know. The video should mention Bernstein.
But they all thought that the Soviet Union was a terrible example to follow. During World War II, there was an uneasy alliance between...
And what does that sound like today? Well, we like socialism. Socialism's good. Just not any existing socialist country, not any country in the global south or the east who's actually trying socialism. We just need to do it in the West electorally, and then that'll be real socialism. It's just like the social democrats and pseudo-socialists of today. Usually this phenomena historically and today stems from the academy. It's academics who are like, yeah, Marx was right about all this stuff. Marxism's a great method and tool of analysis. But I don't want all that revolutionary stuff because that's dangerous and scary, and I'm comfortable in my position at the college I work at. So that's usually where this anti-revolutionary Bernsteinian Marxism stems from.
Socialists, capitalists, and communists, as they all struggled against their common enemies. But when that was over and the Cold War started, socialists around Europe started becoming progressively more moderate. They started defining themselves as democratic socialists, people who, yes, wanted some government control over industry, but were committed to doing so by democratic means, unlike the communists in the USSR. The Labour Party won the 1945 election in Britain on a socialist platform, and
it's actually the opposite, though. The reason the Bolsheviks were successful in the USSR was because they actually had popular support, right? The Mensheviks were allying with the capitalists, these sort of pseudo-socialists were allying themselves with the bourgeoisie and saying, oh, we're not actually going to change that much. We're not actually going to transition that much. Not much will change for the wealthy in Russia, right? They were starting to move towards that direction. We're not actually going to shatter the state machinery and build something new that serves the workers. We'll just slowly kind of transition out of it. And basically, they wanted to keep the ruling minority in power when the vast majority of the country wanted a new system. They wanted to smash the monarchy and build something new. So the reason the Mensheviks and these electoral socialists in Russia were trying to keep power using the claim of democracy, the same way capitalists always do. We have a democracy. You can't have an uprising. You can't change the system that is not actually a democracy that always keeps the wealthy in power. You have to leave that system the same and change it democratically. It doesn't make any sense. But because Lenin knew that the Bolsheviks had the mass support, not only of the industrial workers, but also the peasants in the country, they knew that they would be able to seize power and transform the state machinery into something that actually served the workers. And he was proven correct. So, just because the pseudo-socialists and these Mensheviks at the time use these words like democracy doesn't mean they're actually the ones arguing for democracy. Lenin was the one actually arguing for democracy. He was the one actually arguing for to change the system towards a system that served the masses. And it was the Mensheviks and the Bernsteinians and the Reformists, as Lenin would call them, who wanted to keep the ruling class in power using democracy as a justification.
And the UK didn't exactly turn into Russia. They created a national healthcare system and nationalized major utilities, and when they lost the elections to the Conservatives in 1951, they peacefully relinquished power. In Germany, the Marxist SDP had become one of Germany's most powerful political parties, but after losing a few elections in a row really badly, they basically completely rewrote their platform, giving up.
Are you not going to mention how all the Marxists and socialists in the German Social Democratic Party were killed by fascist paramilitaries? How all the revolutionaries like Rosa Luxemburg were murdered by collaborations between the fascists, the people who would eventually bring Hitler to power, and the pseudo-socialists, these supporters of democracy that you're talking about, allied themselves with the fascists to kill revolutionaries like Rosa Luxemburg? And you're not even going to mention that history. You're just going to say they started losing elections, so they threw out Marxism? Come on. This is so ahistorical. And that, if you look at what happened in the UK, where the Labour Party was trying to take power via elections and they were eventually ousted. China and the Soviet Union were able to consolidate support of the peoples, consolidate support of the masses in their revolutionary struggle. China is still around today, still the largest socialist country in the world, and now one of the largest economies in the world that's abolished poverty. The Soviet Union eventually fell, but it lasted much longer than any sort of socialism that was in the UK, which was actually just social democracy that came about because of economic crisis and mass worker struggle from the bottom up. But either way, now the UK is this neoliberal hellhole ever since Thatcher, and the NHS is being dismantled, and workers and ambulance workers and nurses are on strike. So they totally reverted to neoliberal capitalism to the point where the workers are ready to rise up again. Versus China, actually did transition to socialism. The Soviet Union actually did transition to socialism. So how do you not realize in laying all this stuff out that Lenin was right?
Up on Marxism and instead embracing a moderate form of socialism where government would protect the rights of workers while still allowing the existence of capitalism, what they called a social market economy. All across Europe, socialism stopped meaning complete overthrow of current capitalist institutions and started meaning more government influence over the economy than exists right now. Meanwhile, in the United States,
I got to read Thomas Reagan's book on Eurocommunism because I don't know the history of Europe super well and whether, this is actually what happened with the word socialism. I know it did start to move towards reformism, and there was tons of CIA, bourgeois, MI6 infiltration of the socialist movements and of socialist academics. And Thomas Riggins, who writes for our website, has a book about it, about Eurocommunism and how things started to change. But also, how are those welfare states doing today? Right? How is this capitalist socialist hybrid where we do things for the workers while allowing capitalists to keep exploiting them? In all those countries where that happened, the social safety net's been dismantled. One, the social safety net was only implemented because of class struggle, right? It was only implemented because the workers were unionized and organized and said, you better give us some concessions or we're going to overthrow the system. But now all those concessions are being repealed. They're all being dismantled by the capitalist class because that's how capitalism works. Because Marx was right, even though this person keeps saying Marxism has been discredited. All these predictions about the need for revolutionary struggle and capitalism's tendency to concentrate and accumulate wealth and power at the top, which will eventually lead the workers to rise up, and capitalism's tendency to dismantle the social safety net that the workers gain via class struggle have all been proven right with time.
Worked out a bit differently. We had our own socialist party for a while, and during the first few decades of the 20th century, it even got a few congressmen elected. But socialism existed for us at the same time as progressivism, a much more moderate movement that wound up being very influential in the early days of the US's left wing, while the Socialist Party basically just kinda died out. Later, during the Cold War, the words socialist and communist both became permanently linked to our arch nemesis, the USSR, and ever since, the two words have been treated basically like curse words in American politics. So today, we wound up in a bit of a weird semantic situation, where socialist might just mean vaguely left-wing, or it might mean Soviet freedom-hating Russian, depending on exactly who you talk to. A confusing mess, which I hope this video has made at least a little more clear.
It didn't at all, I'm sorry. Even if your intentions were good, if your intentions were good, I hate to tell you that you have failed. You need to do more research. I don't expect you to read all 3 volumes of Capital, but I do expect you to know who Edward Bernstein is. I'm sorry. You can't talk about reformism and the split between Lenin and the reformists without talking about Bernstein. Like, come on now. The CIA destroyed socialism in the West. Yeah, that's the other thing they don't mention. They need to read Gabriel Rockhill. They don't mention that the CIA was supporting, and the MI6 in the UK was supporting any and every academic who would say, yeah, I'm a Marxist. Yeah, I'm a socialist, but I don't think the workers should rise up against the government. That's violent and mean. We should just participate in elections. We should just vote for the Democratic Party over and over and over again. And eventually, somehow, we'll magically get socialism. This is an idea that the ruling class has always, always, always loved, right? Because a lot of academics recognize that Marxism is a great tool of analysis. They recognize that dialectical materialism really helps you understand and see the world and understand capitalism. So the CIA encourages academics to be like, yeah, I'm a dialectical materialist, but revolution is too mean and too bad and too undemocratic. So let's just keep the current system and cross our fingers and hope socialism comes about eventually. It's always been a useful idea for the ruling class. And it's always been an idea that the CIA and the MI6 have injected into the academy, injected into the colleges, the institutions of higher education, like I was saying before, because they know a lot of those people, while they can be intellectual leaders and while they can be huge tools for educating the working masses, a lot of academics are comfortable. If an academic can get paid a whole bunch of money and be a superstar thinker like Adorno and Horkheimer and a lot of these Frankfurt School pseudo-Marxist thinkers, they're going to do that because that's a great way to make money and be famous and be successful under the current system without actually attacking the way that the current system functions. It's so easy to be an opportunist. That video was a trip, LOL. It was. It really was.